What if the ground beneath your feet has always known more than you do? What if the earth itself, in certain places, carries the memory of every civilization that ever trembled above it? Every people who ever looked at the sky and decided that what lay below was safer than what lay above. What if the answer to the deepest questions about human endurance is not written in stone monuments or royal proclamations or the celebrated records of victorious empires, but carved into darkness, sealed behind doors that only open from the inside, breathing quietly in the cool, still air of a world that the surface forgot? There is a town in the heart of Turkey, a quiet place called Derinkuyu, where the streets are ordinary, the houses are modest, the morning smell of bread and dust, and the particular stillness of the Anatolian plateau. Children play in the lanes between low buildings. Merchants arrange their goods in the morning light. The rhythm of daily life moves at the pace it has always moved in small towns, unhurried, familiar, rooted in the particular textures of a specific place. And beneath those streets, beneath those houses, beneath the gardens and the market squares and the everyday texture of a life lived in the open air, there is another city entirely. Not a ruin, not a cellar, a city. 18 stories of carved stone descending into the earth, deep enough that the world above becomes a distant rumour, deep enough that the temperature never changes regardless of what season burns or freezes the surface, deep enough that 20,000 people could vanish into it and leave no trace visible to anyone standing in the sunlight above. In 1963, a man doing home renovations swung a sledgehammer into a wall and found darkness on the other side. Not a room, not a forgotten storage space, darkness that breathed, that had depth, that opened into corridors and chambers and stairwells, descending through solid volcanic rock towards something the modern world had entirely forgotten was there. He grabbed a light. He stepped inside. The air was cool and ancient and perfectly still. And the deeper he walked, the larger the world beneath him became. This is the story of Derinkuyu, but it is also something larger than that. It is the story of what drives human beings underground, what keeps them there, what they build in the dark when the surface world becomes unlivable, and what it means that they built it so well, so completely, so durably, that the stone remembers everything even after the people are gone. It is the story of a civilization that refused to be destroyed by simply becoming invisible. It is the story of 20,000 people who looked at the world's violence and chose, with extraordinary deliberateness, to go below it. Before we go further into the depths of this story, if you find yourself drawn to the kind of history that hides beneath the surface of what we think we know, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like on this video. It helps the archive stay open. And if you are listening in the dark somewhere right now, in whatever corner of the world has brought you to this particular hour, drop a comment and tell me where you are and what time it is. There is something quietly remarkable about the idea of people scattered across continents, all settling into the same darkness, all drawn to the same buried questions. I want to imagine that silence stretching across the world while we explore this together. Now, let us go down. The volcanic plateau of Cappadocia in central Anatolia is one of those landscapes that seems to have been designed by something other than ordinary geological process. If you have seen photographs of it, you know what it looks like. Tall conical spires of pale stone, called fairy chimneys, rising from the earth in clusters, their tops capped with darker rock, their sides riddled with openings carved by human hands or worn smooth by wind and time. Deep valleys cutting through the plateau, their walls glowing in shades of pink and ochre and white, depending on the hour and the angle of the light. A terrain that looks, in certain lights, like something dreamed rather than made, like the work of an imagination rather than the slow grinding of geological time. But the dreamlike quality of Cappadocia is not mystical. It is geological, and understanding the geology is the first step toward understanding why Derinkuyu exists at all. Because the earth here did not merely permit the construction of an underground city. It practically invited it. It made the invitation irresistible. The landscape is not a passive backdrop to the story of Derinkuyu. It is one of the story's authors. Tens of millions of years ago, the tectonic plates grinding against one another beneath Anatolia created weak points in the Earth's crust, where magma could surge upward. The volcanoes that resulted were not gentle, picturesque mountains. They were catastrophic systems. Erciyes, Hassan, Goludar. These names mean little to most people today, but the mountains they describe once dominated the Cappadocian landscape and periodically exploded with a violence that reshaped everything around them. Pyroclastic flows, avalanches of superheated gas and rock fragments moving at hundreds of miles per hour swept across the plateau again and again across geological time. Ash fell like snow and never melted. It accumulated in layers, compressed under its own weight, fused together by heat and time into a material called tuff. Tuff is the key to everything. The word comes from the Italian, describing the volcanic rock found around Naples and Rome, regions that share Cappadocia's violent geological heritage. Tuff is not a single substance, but a family of materials, all sharing one defining characteristic. They form from volcanic ash that falls while still warm and compacts into stone. And tuff has properties that make it almost unique among building materials. Properties that the people of Cappadocia came to understand with an intimacy born of necessity. It is porous, full of tiny air pockets left by gas bubbles in the original ash. This makes it light, far less dense than granite or limestone. It is also, when freshly exposed, remarkably soft. Soft enough that ancient tools, bronze or even hardened stone, can work it with patience. An experienced carver can move through fresh tuff at a rate that would be impossible with harder rock. You do not need explosives or industrial equipment. You need time, determination, and the knowledge that the stone will cooperate. You need the particular kind of faith that comes from understanding the material you are working with, from knowing that the stone is not your adversary, but your collaborator. But here is the paradox built into the rock itself, the paradox that made Derinkuyu possible. Tuff is soft enough to carve, but once carved, it hardens. When you cut into it and expose the interior surface to air, a process called induration begins. Moisture evaporates. Minerals recrystallize. The carved surface gradually becomes more durable than it was before you touched it. Spaces hollowed out 1,000 years ago remain stable today, supporting the weight of the rock above, without collapsing, without crumbling, without betraying the people who trusted their lives to the stone. The act of carving strengthens what you have carved. The act of opening the rock makes it more permanent. This is the geological gift that Cappadocia offered to anyone desperate enough to accept it. The people who eventually carved Derinkuyu did not invent this knowledge. They learned it from the landscape itself, because Cappadocia had been teaching humans about tuff for millennia before the first underground city was dug. Every cliff face, every natural cave, every wind-carved hollow demonstrated what the stone could do. Soft enough to erode into extraordinary shapes, strong enough to stand as pillars and towers for geological ages. The landscape was a textbook written in rock, and the people who lived on the plateau had been reading it for a very long time. And then there is the thermal property, which may be the most important of all. The thickness and porosity of tuff give it extraordinary insulation. Measurements taken inside Cappadocia's underground spaces show that internal temperatures remain between roughly 55 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, regardless of what is happening at the surface. In summer, when the Anatolian plateau bakes under temperatures that can exceed 100 degrees, the underground chambers remain cool and still. In winter, when the plateau freezes and the wind cuts across the open land with a sharpness that makes the skin ache, the deep tunnels stay mild. Humidity is similarly regulated. The porous rock absorbs excess moisture and releases it slowly, preventing the damp, mold-prone conditions you might expect in a sealed cave system. Combine this natural thermal regulation with the ventilation engineering built into Derinkuyu, the shafts and air channels carved throughout its 18 levels, and you create an environment that is not merely survivable underground, but genuinely comfortable. You could live there for months and never feel the physical misery that the idea of underground existence might suggest. The earth itself, in this particular place, seemed designed to accommodate human refugees. It offered them cool air and stable temperature and structural reliability, all the things a frightened community needs when the world above has become too dangerous to inhabit. That is the strange invitation Cappadocia extended across millennia. Other regions have caves, other places have soft stone, but few combine workability, structural stability, and environmental regulation the way Cappadocian tuff does. It is almost as if the landscape was waiting for people desperate enough to accept its offer. And desperate people came, wave after wave of them, across thousands of years, each generation finding the same solution, carving a little deeper into the same obliging stone, adding their own rooms and corridors and refinements to what the previous generation had left behind. Before we can understand who built Derinkuyu, we need to understand where it sits in the larger geography of the ancient world. Cappadocia occupies the heart of Anatolia, a high plateau perched between mountain ranges and river valleys that have always funneled movement across the continent. To the south, the Taurus Mountains rise like a wall, separating the plateau from the Mediterranean coast and the plains of Syria. To the north, the land slopes toward the Black Sea through a maze of passes and highlands. East and west, the plateau stretches toward the Iranian frontier and the Aegean coast, creating natural corridors that link three continents. This geography is not merely interesting, it is destiny. If you wanted to move goods, armies, or ideas between Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean, between the Iranian plateau and Europe, between the wealth of the East and the powers of the West, you crossed Anatolia. And Cappadocia sat right in the middle of that crossing, unavoidable, inescapable, perpetually in the path of everyone going anywhere. The plateau was not a destination. It was a corridor, and corridors belong to whoever is moving through them at any given moment. As early as the second millennium before the Common Era, long before Derinkuyu was imagined, merchants from Assyria established trading colonies on the plateau. At Kultepe, near modern Kayseri, archaeologists have found thousands of cuneiform tablets, business records from commercial outposts handling caravans that moved tin and textiles and silver between Mesopotamia and Anatolia. These were not temporary camps. They were permanent settlements with warehouses and residential quarters and administrative buildings, evidence of how thoroughly this plateau was integrated into the ancient world's commercial networks. Trade brought prosperity. Prosperity brought visibility. And visibility in the ancient world inevitably brought danger. The Hittites came after, building their empire with its capital at Hattusa, not far from Cappadocia's northern edge. Then the Phrygians, who left architectural traces in the region. Then the Persians, who absorbed Anatolia into their vast empire and gave Cappadocia its name, from the old Persian Katpatuka, meaning the land of beautiful horses, a name that captures something essential about the plateau's open grasslands and the animals that thrived there. Then Alexander the Great swept through, and after him the Seleucids, and after them the Romans, who made Cappadocia a province and built roads across it and integrated it into the machinery of empire. Each civilization left its mark. Each one also left its wounds. Each of these civilizations passed through or settled in Cappadocia. Each one left traces, and each one, in their passing or their conquest or their withdrawal, added another layer of instability to a region that had never known prolonged peace. Because sitting at the crossroads of empires means being fought over by empires. It means watching armies march through your fields. It means knowing that whatever power currently claims authority over you might be replaced by another power before the season turns. The people of Cappadocia were not the subjects of history. They were its terrain. The people of Cappadocia learned this lesson early and never forgot it. They learned to read the horizon for dust clouds that meant cavalry. They learned to listen for the particular silence that falls before an army arrives, that uncanny stillness when the birds stop and the animals grow restless and the air itself seems to hold its breath. And at some point, at some moment we cannot precisely date, they learned to look downward rather than outward. They learned that the safest horizon was the one beneath their feet. The question of who first dug Derinkuyu is genuinely contested, and the honest answer is that we do not know with certainty. The earliest occupation of the site appears to extend back to the Bronze Age, possibly to the Hittite period in the second millennium before the Common Era. But the evidence for this is architectural and inferential rather than documentary. The Hittites were sophisticated builders who understood the defensive value of underground spaces, and the region's soft volcanic rock would have been immediately recognizable to any people with construction experience. Some researchers suggest the earliest levels of Derinkuyu may date to this period, carved as storage and emergency shelter by communities already familiar with the tough's properties. The Phrygians, who dominated central Anatolia after the collapse of the Hittite Empire around 1200 BCE, are more confidently associated with early underground construction in the region. Phrygian architectural traces appear in several Cappadocian underground sites, and the Phrygians were known for their sophisticated stonework and their understanding of the plateau's geology. They may have significantly expanded whatever existed before them, transforming small shelters into more elaborate complexes. What began as a hollow in the rock became a room. What began as a room became a corridor. What began as a corridor became a city. The transformation happened slowly, across generations, each one inheriting the work of the previous one and adding to it. But here is what the archaeology makes clear. Derinkuyu was not built by a single civilization in a single period. It was built by many hands across many centuries, each generation inheriting what the previous one had dug and expanding it according to their own needs and fears. The city grew the way a coral reef grows, through the accumulated work of countless individuals over vast stretches of time, each one adding to something that would outlast them by millennia. There is no single architect of Derinkuyu. There is only the long collaboration of frightened, ingenious, determined human beings across 2,000 years of continuous threat. What we can say with more confidence is that by the time the Byzantine period began, in the 4th century of the Common Era, underground living in Cappadocia was already an ancient tradition. The Christians, who would transform these spaces into something more than mere shelters, were not pioneers. They were inheritors, people who found an existing infrastructure of subterranean survival and adapted it to their own particular circumstances and their own particular faith. They brought their prayers into spaces that had been carved by hands that prayed to different gods, and the stone received them all equally. Imagine descending into Derinkuyu for the first time, not as a modern tourist with electric lights and safety railings, but as someone who actually lived there, who knew its corridors the way you know the rooms of your own house, who had learned its layout as a child, been walked through it by a parent who had learned it from their own parent, the knowledge passing from hand to hand across generations like something precious and fragile and absolutely necessary. You enter through one of the many concealed openings, most of which would have been hidden under ordinary-looking structures at the surface. A house, a storage building, a trapdoor beneath a heavy rug. You descend a carved staircase, the stone cool and slightly rough beneath your hands. The light from above fades quickly. You carry a lamp, oil burning steadily, its flame barely flickering in the still air. The sound of the surface world diminishes with each step. The voices, the animals, the wind. They become muffled, then absent. You are in a different world now, one that operates by different rules. The first levels are the most active. Stables for animals, their stone troughs still visible today, carved directly from the rock with a precision that speaks to long practice. Kitchens with ventilation channels designed to carry smoke upward and outward without revealing its source at the surface. Storage rooms filled with ceramic jars, grain, oil, wine. The logistics of feeding 20,000 people underground required extraordinary planning, and the evidence of that planning is carved into every level. the quantities of food that would need to be stored, the rotation of supplies to prevent spoilage, the management of water from the deep wells that tap underground aquifers. All of this had to be organized and maintained with the precision of a military operation, because that is, in a very real sense, what it was. Deeper down, the character of the space changes. The corridors narrow in some places, deliberately. A passage that forces you to walk single file, slightly hunched, is a passage that an invading soldier cannot rush through quickly. It is a passage where a single defender can hold off many attackers. The architects of Derinkuyu understood something fundamental about defensive architecture. The geometry of a space determines the dynamics of violence within it. They designed their city so that its very shape made conquest difficult. The stone itself was weaponized against those who would use violence to enter it. And then there are the doors. The rolling stone doors of Derinkuyu are among the most remarkable engineering achievements of the ancient world, though they are rarely celebrated as such. These are circular stones shaped like enormous millstones, weighing hundreds of kilograms each. They are positioned at key points throughout the complex, and they roll on tracks carved into the floor with a smoothness that suggests careful mathematical planning. When closed, they seal a corridor completely, creating a barrier that cannot be forced from the outside. But here is the crucial detail. They can only be opened from the inside. There is a small hole in the center of each door, through which a spear or a pike could be thrust to attack anyone attempting to break through. But the mechanism for opening the door is entirely on the interior side. If you are on the outside of one of these doors and the people inside it do not choose to open it, you are not getting through, not without equipment that no ancient army would have carried through miles of underground tunnels. The doors are not just barriers. They are a statement of intent. We have gone inside. We have sealed ourselves in. We will wait you out. The door is both a physical object and a philosophical declaration. This detail matters more than it might initially seem. It tells us something profound about the psychology of the people who built and used Derinkuyu. They were not building a fortress designed to project power outward. They were building a refuge designed to make themselves invisible and unreachable. The goal was not to fight. The goal was to disappear. And disappearance, it turns out, is one of the most effective forms of resistance ever devised. There is a ventilation system that modern engineers have studied with genuine admiration. Derinkuyu has at least 52 ventilation shafts, some of them descending more than 50 meters from the surface, carefully positioned to create airflow throughout the complex. The deepest levels of the city receive fresh air through a system that operates on natural convection, the movement of air driven by temperature differentials between the cool underground spaces and the warmer surface. This is not accidental. This required understanding of airflow principles that we might assume to be modern, but clearly were not. The shafts are angled and positioned with precision that suggests either sophisticated empirical knowledge or centuries of accumulated trial and error, or both. The people who designed this system understood how air moves through enclosed spaces in a way that any modern HVAC engineer would recognize as fundamentally correct. The water supply is equally sophisticated. Derinkuyu sits above an underground aquifer, and wells were dug through the rock to reach it. These wells are internal to the complex, meaning that a besieged population could access water without ever needing to surface. The wells are also designed with a particular feature. They can be blocked from below. If an enemy managed to find and poison a surface water source, the people underground could seal their wells from the inside and protect their supply. Every contingency was considered. Every vulnerability was addressed. The architects of Derinkuyu thought through the problem of siege with a thoroughness that speaks to long experience with exactly that kind of threat. There are churches carved into the lower levels, their barrel-vaulted ceilings still intact, their walls bearing the faint traces of what were once frescoes. There are meeting rooms and schools, spaces that suggest organized community life continuing in the dark. There are what appear to be missionary schools, rooms where Christian communities maintain the practice of education even during periods of siege. There are wine cellars because the people who built this place understood that survival without some quality of life is merely endurance. And endurance without meaning eventually breaks the human spirit. They were not trying to simply not die. They were trying to continue living, which is a different and more demanding ambition. The presence of churches is particularly significant. By the time Christianity became the dominant religion of the region, probably during the Byzantine period from the 4th century onward, Derinkuyu had been adapted into something more than a military refuge. It had become a spiritual community. The people who descended into it carried their faith with them, and they built spaces to practice that faith even in the deepest levels of the earth. There is something quietly extraordinary about the idea of a congregation gathered in a stone church 18 stories underground, singing hymns that no one above could hear, maintaining the rituals of their belief in a darkness that the surface world had no knowledge of. The sacred does not require the sky. It requires only the commitment of those who practice it. The Byzantine period is when we have the most documentary evidence for the use of Cappadocian underground cities, and the picture that emerges is more nuanced than simple terror-driven refuge. Yes, the underground cities were used during periods of invasion and persecution, but they were also integrated into the everyday life of Cappadocian Christian communities in ways that suggest something more complex than pure survival architecture. The Cappadocian Fathers, the great theologians of early Christianity, Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory of Nazianzus, all lived and worked in this region during the 4th century. They were aware of the underground communities and the practices that sustained them. Basil of Caesarea, who is credited with establishing the model for communal monastic life in the Christian East, understood the plateau's underground tradition as something more than emergency infrastructure. He saw in the withdrawal from the surface world a spiritual practice, a form of intentional separation from the distractions and dangers of ordinary life that could serve the purposes of contemplation and prayer. The tradition of monastic retreat, of withdrawing from the world to pursue spiritual discipline, found a literal architectural expression in the underground cities of Cappadocia. Monks and hermits carved cells into cliff faces throughout the region. Communities gathered in underground spaces for worship and study. The boundary between hiding from physical danger and retreating from worldly distraction was not always clear, and perhaps it did not need to be. But the physical dangers were real, very real, and they came in waves that would have tested the endurance of any community. The history of Cappadocia during the Byzantine period is essentially a history of repeated catastrophe followed by repeated recovery, a rhythm of descent and resurfacing that the underground cities both enabled and symbolized. The Arab raids of the 7th and 8th centuries were the first great test of the Byzantine period, beginning in the 630s and continuing for more than 2 centuries. Arab armies from the expanding Islamic Caliphate repeatedly crossed into Anatolia. Cappadocia, sitting at the crossroads of the invasion routes, was struck again and again. The plateau that had always been a highway for armies became a corridor for destruction. Villages were burned, populations were carried off as slaves. The agricultural infrastructure that sustained settled communities was systematically disrupted. Crops were destroyed, orchards were cut down. The surface world, already precarious, became genuinely uninhabitable for extended periods. It is during this period that the documentary record most clearly associates Derinkuyu and the other underground cities with active use as refuges. Byzantine sources describe populations disappearing underground when Arab raiding parties approached, sealing themselves in with their livestock and their food stores and their sacred objects, waiting in the dark while the world above burned. The raids rarely lasted long enough for a besieging force to outlast a well-supplied underground community. A raiding party wants plunder and captives, not a prolonged siege of a city they cannot see. So they would search, find nothing, and eventually move on. And the people underground would wait, listening through the ventilation shafts for the sounds of departure, counting days, rationing carefully, praying in their stone churches. Consider what that waiting must have been like. 20,000 people in the dark. The children who had never seen an Arab army but had been taught since birth what to do when the warning came, who had practiced the descent into the tunnels the way other children practice fire drills, who knew the corridors by feel as much as by sight, the elderly who had perhaps descended into these tunnels multiple times across a long life, each time hoping it would be the last, the animals whose noise and smell and warmth filled the lower levels, whose presence was both a comfort and a logistical challenge. The lamps burning carefully, conserved, because oil was finite and darkness was absolute. The ventilation shafts bringing air from above, and with it, sometimes, the sounds of what was happening on the surface. Fire, shouting, the particular quality of silence that follows destruction. And then, eventually, the sound of nothing, the return of ordinary Anatolian wind across the plateau. The moment when someone, perhaps the community's leader, perhaps simply the bravest or most desperate person present, would climb toward the surface and ease open a concealed entrance and look out at whatever remained of the world above. That moment of emergence, of blinking in the light after days or weeks in the dark, of seeing what the surface world had become in the interval, must have been one of the most charged experiences in a human life. Sometimes they found their town intact, the raiders having passed without stopping. Sometimes they found ruins, and they would climb out anyway, because the alternative was to stay underground forever. And even the most terrible surface was still the surface, still the place where grain could be grown, and children could run, and the sun could be seen. The surface was always worth returning to, however damaged it might be. This cycle, descend and wait and resurface and rebuild, repeated across generations. It became part of the cultural DNA of Cappadocian communities. The knowledge of the underground city was passed from parent to child, the way other communities passed down the knowledge of fishing or farming, or the particular way the wind moves before a storm. You learned the entrances, you learned the layout. You learned which corridors led where, which doors to seal first, how to manage the ventilation, how to ration the stored food, how to keep the children calm in the dark, how to maintain community cohesion when the walls of the world had narrowed to carved stone and lamplight. This was not esoteric knowledge reserved for specialists. It was practical survival knowledge that everyone needed to possess. And this is one of the most remarkable things about Derinkuyu, something that gets lost in the archaeological descriptions of ventilation shafts and rolling stone doors. This city was maintained as living knowledge in human memory across centuries. The people who used it did not have blueprints or technical manuals. They had the accumulated understanding of their community, passed down through teaching and practice, and the specific kind of memory that comes from having been somewhere, from having moved through a space with your own body and learned its dimensions and its character and its possibilities. The city lived in human minds as much as in stone, and when the communities who carried that knowledge were finally forced to leave, the city fell silent. Not because it was destroyed, because the memory of it left with the people. I want to pause here and ask you something. Other cultures built hidden worlds of their own, spaces carved out of necessity and preserved in silence. What other buried histories stay with you? The ones that feel like they have been deliberately left out of the story we are usually told. Leave that in the comments. I think this community carries more of those threads than any single archive could hold. The population exchange of 1923, one of the largest forced migrations in modern history, removed the Greek Orthodox and Armenian Christian communities who had maintained knowledge of Derinkuyu for centuries. These communities, whose ancestors had used the tunnels across generations of Byzantine and Ottoman history, were relocated to Greece under the terms of the Treaty of Lausanne. They took almost nothing with them. They left behind their churches, their homes, their graveyards, the particular quality of light on the plateau in the early morning, the smell of the volcanic earth after rain, and they left behind the knowledge of the city beneath their feet. The entrances were sealed or forgotten. The complex sat in silence for 40 years, until 1963, when a sledgehammer found the wall that was not a wall, and the darkness breathed again. The city had been waiting. It had always been waiting. That is what cities carved into volcanic rock do. Derinkuyu is the most famous of the Cappadocian underground cities, but it is far from the only one. Archaeologists have identified more than 200 underground settlements scattered across the region, at least 40 of them with 3 or more levels of significant depth and complexity. Some of these are connected to each other by tunnels stretching for miles through the bedrock, creating a subterranean network that once allowed communities to move between sites without ever surfacing. The underground world of Cappadocia was not a single city. It was a civilization, distributed through the rock, connected by passages that the surface world knew nothing about. The city of Kaymakli, located about 9 kilometers from Derinkuyu, is similarly impressive in scale and sophistication. The two cities are believed to be connected by a tunnel approximately 9 kilometers long. Though this tunnel has not been fully explored or confirmed by modern archaeology, the idea of it is extraordinary. A passage through solid rock connecting two underground cities, long enough that travelling its length would take hours, creating a subterranean corridor between refuges. If the connection exists as described, it represents an engineering achievement of staggering ambition. A highway built not across the land, but through it, invisible to any army that might be searching the surface. Other underground sites in the region show different aspects of the tradition. Some appear to have been primarily agricultural, designed for the storage of food and wine rather than long-term habitation. Others show evidence of specialized functions, workshops, scriptoria, spaces for the production of goods. The underground network of Cappadocia was not a single system with a single purpose. It was an entire civilization's response to the particular conditions of life on a plateau where danger was constant and the ground was always willing to receive those who needed to disappear. The scale of the collective enterprise, when you try to hold it in your mind all at once, is genuinely staggering. Hundreds of sites, thousands of rooms, millions of cubic meters of rock removed by hand, carried out through the same narrow corridors that would later serve as defensive choke points. The labor involved in creating Derinkuyu alone, setting aside the entire regional network, represents an investment of human effort that rivals the construction of the great monuments of the ancient world. The pyramids of Giza are celebrated as engineering achievements of the first order. Derinkuyu is their equal in ambition and complexity, but it was built to be invisible. It was built to be forgotten, and it was. This is one of the paradoxes at the heart of the Derinkuyu story. The people who built it were not building for posterity. They were not building a monument to themselves or their civilization. They were building a place to hide. The intention was concealment, not commemoration. And yet what they built has outlasted almost everything else from their era, preserved in the same volcanic rock that made its construction possible, waiting in the dark for a sledgehammer to find it again. The monument that was never meant to be a monument has become one of the most remarkable monuments in the world. There is something philosophically interesting in this. The things we build to last, our temples and our palaces and our monuments, often do not. They are targets, they are conspicuous. They attract the attention of every subsequent civilization that wants to assert its dominance by erasing or repurposing what came before. But the things we build to be hidden, the things we carve into darkness and seal behind rolling stone doors, those survive precisely because no one knows they are there to destroy. The archive that hides survives. The archive that announces itself gets burned. Now, the question that has been building through everything we have discussed deserves its full attention. Why did 20,000 people choose to live underground? What threat was so overwhelming, so persistent, so terrifying that generation after generation made this choice, expanded this city, taught their children its layout, and descended into it again and again across more than 2,000 years? The conventional answer is invasion. The Arab raids of the 7th and 8th centuries, the Mongol incursions of the 13th century when Genghis Khan's successors swept through Anatolia and left devastation that took generations to recover from. The various other armies that cross the plateau across its long history of being in everyone's way. These are real answers supported by real evidence. The underground cities were absolutely used during these periods, and the people who used them had excellent reasons to do so. But the conventional answer may be incomplete, because if invasion were the only driver, we would expect the underground cities to be simpler. Emergency shelters are not 18 stories deep. Emergency shelters do not have churches and schools and wine cellars and stables and sophisticated ventilation systems. Emergency shelters do not represent the accumulated labor of centuries. The scale and sophistication of Derinkuyu suggests something more than a response to a specific external threat. It suggests a way of life, a civilization that had internalized the underground as a fundamental part of its existence, not merely as a last resort, but as a parallel world maintained alongside the surface world, always ready, always stocked, always accessible. Consider the logistics of maintaining Derinkuyu in a state of readiness. The food stores would need to be rotated regularly to prevent spoilage. The ventilation shafts would need to be cleared of debris. The wells would need to be maintained. The rolling stone doors would need to be exercised to prevent them from seizing in their tracks. The lamps and oil supplies would need to be inventoried and replenished. This is not the maintenance of an emergency shelter. This is the maintenance of a living city. It required ongoing labor, ongoing organization, ongoing community commitment across generation. Someone had to be responsible for the underground city even during the years, perhaps the decades, when no one needed to use it. Someone had to remember, which suggests that the people of Derinkuyu did not think of the underground city as something separate from their ordinary lives. They thought of it as part of their ordinary lives. The surface world and the underground world were not alternatives. They were complements. You lived above, you maintained what was below. And when the warning came, you moved between them as fluidly as you moved between rooms in a house. The underground city was not an escape from ordinary life. It was an extension of it, the part of ordinary life that dealt with the extraordinary possibility of catastrophe. This reframing changes the question slightly. It is not only why did they choose to live underground, it is how did they develop a civilization that incorporated underground living as a permanent feature of its existence. And the answer to that question reaches into something deeper than any specific invasion or any specific threat. It reaches into the particular relationship between a community and its landscape. The way that long habitation of a dangerous place eventually produces a culture perfectly adapted to that danger. A culture that has internalized the threat so completely that its response to the threat becomes indistinguishable from its ordinary way of being. The people of Cappadocia lived at the intersection of empires for so long that instability was not an exception to their experience. It was the condition of their experience. There was no golden age of safety from which they fell into danger. There was only the ongoing negotiation with a world that had always been dangerous and would always be dangerous, punctuated by periods of relative calm that everyone understood to be temporary. In such a world, you do not wait for the next crisis to begin preparing. You maintain your preparations continuously, because the next crisis is always coming, and the only question is when. In such a world, the calculus of investment changes. You do not invest heavily in surface structures that can be burned or looted because you know they will eventually be burned or looted. You invest in what cannot be taken from you, what is too deep and too hidden for any army to find. You invest in the underground because the underground is yours in a way that the surface never quite is. You can be driven from the surface. You cannot be driven from the depths. The depths will wait for you exactly as you left them, however long the surface world takes to become habitable again. There is a kind of wisdom in this that feels alien to modern sensibilities. We build upward, we build visibly, we build to be seen and to last, and we accept the vulnerability that visibility creates. The people of Derinkuyu built downward, they built invisibly, they built to be unfindable, and they accepted the limitations that invisibility imposed. Neither approach is simply right or wrong. They are responses to different conditions, different threats, different relationships with the world. But there is something in the Derinkuyu approach that deserves more than archaeological admiration. It deserves philosophical attention. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century represent perhaps the most severe test the underground cities ever faced. When the Mongol armies of the Ilkhanate swept through Anatolia following the Battle of Köse Dağ in 1243, the devastation was comprehensive in a way that even the Arab raids had not been. The Mongols were not raiding parties looking for plunder and moving on. They were a conquering force that intended to remain, and their methods of warfare were designed to make resistance as costly as possible. Cities that resisted were destroyed. Populations that fled were hunted. The surface world of Anatolia was transformed, in the space of a few years, into something that its inhabitants barely recognized. Cappadocia suffered severely. The surface settlements of the region were devastated. The source agricultural infrastructure was disrupted in ways that took generations to repair. Populations fled in all directions, and many of those who fled went underground. The archaeological record from this period, combined with documentary sources, suggests that the Mongol invasions drove a significant expansion of underground habitation in the region. Communities that had previously used the underground cities only intermittently began using them more continuously. The distinction between the surface world and the underground world became less sharp because the surface world had become so dangerous that extended periods underground were not exceptional circumstances but ordinary life. It is worth pausing to hold this in mind. Extended periods underground, months possibly, in the dark with the animals, with the stored food slowly diminishing, with the lamps burning down, with the children who had never known anything but stone walls and the sound of ventilation air, with the elderly who remembered a surface world that no longer existed in the form they had known it. The psychological demands of this existence must have been extraordinary, and yet the communities endured. They maintained their social structures, their religious practices, their sense of collective identity. They did not dissolve into chaos or despair, or if they did, they recovered, because they always came back up. The question that occasionally surfaces in discussions of Derinkuyu, usually from people who have encountered the more speculative literature about the site, deserves direct attention. Not to dismiss it, but because examining why it arises tells us something interesting about how we relate to history and to the full scope of human capability. The ancient astronaut hypothesis applied to Derinkuyu suggests that the city was built either by or for extraterrestrial beings, or that it was constructed to protect against some catastrophic event of cosmic origin. The evidence offered for these claims typically involves the city's scale, which is described as beyond the capabilities of ancient peoples, and various architectural features that are interpreted as having non-human purposes. But the evidence does not support these interpretations, and examining why it does not is illuminating. The scale of Derinkuyu, while genuinely impressive, is not beyond the capabilities of organized human communities working over centuries with appropriate tools and sufficient motivation. We have extensive documentation of ancient peoples undertaking comparable or larger engineering projects with the tools and knowledge available to them. The pyramids of Giza, the temples of Karnak, the aqueducts of Rome, the Great Walls of China. Human beings organized into communities with shared purposes and sufficient time are capable of extraordinary things. Derinkuyu is extraordinary. It is not inexplicable. What the ancient astronaut theories reveal, when you examine them carefully, is not evidence of extraterrestrial involvement, but evidence of how uncomfortable we sometimes are with the full scope of human capability and human suffering. It is easier, in some ways, to imagine that Derinkuyu was built by or for beings beyond our comprehension than to sit with the reality that ordinary human beings, frightened and determined and remarkably ingenious, built this city out of nothing but necessity and stone and time. That the same species capable of extraordinary cruelty is also capable of extraordinary creativity in response to that cruelty. The truth of Derinkuyu is more interesting than any alternative explanation. It is a monument to human endurance built by human hands in response to human violence. Every carved corridor, every rolling stone door, every ventilation shaft is the work of someone who looked at the world's danger and refused to be destroyed by it. When the last Cappadocian Greek and Armenian communities left the region in 1923, they took almost nothing with them. The population exchange was rapid and largely involuntary, and the communities had little time to prepare. They left behind their churches, their monasteries, their homes, their cemeteries, and they left behind the knowledge of Derinkuyu. But not entirely, because some of those communities resettled in Greece carried memories of the underground city with them. There are accounts from Greek communities in the Peloponnese and in Athens, descendants of Cappadocian refugees who grew up hearing stories from grandparents and great-grandparents about the city beneath the city, about descending into the tunnels when danger came, about the cool air and the stone churches and the rolling doors that kept the world out. These stories were not believed or not fully believed by the people who heard them. They sounded like the kind of thing old people say, the embellished memories of a lost homeland made more dramatic by distance and grief. A city underground, 18 stories deep, 20,000 people. It sounds like myth. And then in 1963, a sledgehammer found the wall, and the myth became stone. The stories the old people told were not embellishments. They were memories. The city they described was exactly where they said it was, exactly as they had described it, waiting in the dark with the patience of stone. Since its rediscovery, Derinkuyu has been excavated and studied by Turkish archaeologists and international researchers. Only a portion of the complex is currently open to the public. Roughly 8 of the estimated 18 levels. The deeper levels remain partially unexplored, and researchers continue to make discoveries. In recent years, ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive technologies have revealed additional chambers and corridors that have not yet been physically accessed. The city is still giving up its secrets. It is still in the process of being understood. In 2014, construction work in the nearby city of Nevşehir revealed another massive underground complex, potentially larger than Derinkuyu, beneath the city centre. Initial surveys suggested it might be the largest underground city ever found in the region, with multiple levels and an area estimated at over 4 million square feet. Excavation is ongoing, and the full extent of the complex is not yet known. The underground world of Cappadocia is still being discovered. The archive is still being opened. There is a broader pattern that Derinkuyu illuminates, something that extends beyond the specific history of Cappadocia and touches on a fundamental aspect of human civilization. Throughout history, in many different cultures and many different landscapes, communities under sustained threat have developed what we might call underground traditions. Not always literally underground, but always involving the creation of hidden, parallel worlds that exist alongside the visible world and become accessible when the visible world becomes uninhabitable. The cave cities of the American Southwest, where ancestral Puebloan communities built cliff dwellings in locations that were deliberately difficult to access, represent a similar logic. The island crannogs of Scotland and Ireland, artificial islands built in lakes to provide defensible living space, embody the same principle. The hidden synagogues of medieval Europe, the underground churches of early Christianity in Rome, the concealed meeting spaces of persecuted communities across many cultures and many eras. Human beings, when the surface world becomes dangerous, have a remarkable capacity to create interior worlds that preserve what matters most. Derinkuyu is the most elaborate expression of this impulse ever discovered, but it is not unique in kind, only in scale, and that universality is worth sitting with. The impulse to go underground when the world above is dangerous is not specific to Cappadocia or to the cultures that built Derinkuyu. It is something close to a human universal, a response to threat that appears across cultures and continents and millennia. We are, it seems, a species that knows how to go underground, that knows how to wait, that knows how to maintain what matters in the dark until the surface becomes safe again. What does it mean that we know this? What does it mean that this knowledge is so widespread, so persistent, so deeply embedded in human cultural practice across such different times and places? Perhaps it means that the experience of being driven underground, of being forced to hide what you love most from a world that wants to destroy it, is not exceptional in human history. Perhaps it is, in some terrible sense, ordinary. Perhaps the surface world has always been more dangerous than we like to remember, and the underground traditions that appear across cultures are the evidence of that danger preserved in stone and wood and memory. Or perhaps it means something more hopeful. Perhaps the universality of the underground tradition is evidence not of how often humans have been threatened, but of how consistently they have survived. Every underground city, every cliff dwelling, every hidden church and concealed meeting space is evidence of a community that did not give up, that found a way to continue, that maintained what mattered in the dark and eventually came back into the light. Derinkuyu was not abandoned because its people were destroyed. It was abandoned because its people were forced to leave. The distinction matters enormously. The community that built and maintained the underground city survived. They carried their memories across the Aegean. Their descendants are alive today, and the city they left behind survived too, in the stone, waiting for the moment when someone would find it again and ask the questions that its existence demands. The rolling stone doors of Derinkuyu can only be opened from the inside. We have talked about this as a defensive feature, and it is. But there is another way to read it. Those doors can be opened. They are not sealed forever. They are designed to be opened when the time is right, when the danger has passed, when the people inside choose to come out. The city was never meant to be a permanent refuge. It was meant to be a temporary one, a place to wait out the worst of what the world could do, a place to preserve what mattered until the world became habitable again. The door that only opens from the inside is not a door of despair. It is a door of patience, and patience, in the end, is what Derinkuyu is about. The ventilation shafts of Derinkuyu are a good metaphor for this. They are narrow passages connecting the sealed underground world to the open surface world. They allow air to flow in both directions. They keep the underground alive and breathable. But they are also the city's most vulnerable points, the places where the outside world can most easily intrude. The engineers who designed them had to balance two needs that are fundamentally in tension, the need for fresh air and the need for security. They solved this problem with ingenuity, angling the shafts, positioning them carefully, designing them so that they could be blocked quickly if needed. This is the balance the entire city embodies, between openness and closure, between connection to the world above and protection from it, between the need to live and the need to survive. Derinkuyu is the architectural expression of a community that refused to choose between these things. It insisted on both. This is the deepest truth that Derinkuyu has to offer, and it is a quiet one, the kind of truth that settles rather than startles. The city was built by people who believed that the surface world was worth returning to, who believed that what they were preserving underground, their children, their faith, their animals, their wine, their ordinary human lives, was worth the extraordinary effort of preservation, who believed, despite every reason not to, that the danger would eventually pass and the surface would become theirs again. They were not optimists in any naive sense. They had seen too much for that. They were something harder and more durable than optimists. They were people who had decided that continuing was worth the cost of continuing, and who had built an entire civilization around that decision. They were right. The danger always eventually passed. The surface always eventually became theirs again, and they always came back up. The city is still there, 18 stories deep in the volcanic rock of Cappadocia, its ventilation shafts still drawing air from the surface, its rolling stone doors still capable of being opened from the inside, its carved chambers still holding the cool, still air that has been there since the last person sealed the entrance and walked away. The stone churches are empty now. The stables are empty. The wine cellars have been dry for a century. But the city is intact. It waited 40 years for someone to find it, and it will wait as long as it needs to. There is something in that patience that feels important. The archive that hides survives. The knowledge that goes underground outlasts the empires that drove it there. The memory that is carved into stone endures beyond the communities that carved it, waiting to be read by whoever has the patience to descend and look. We are those people in our way. We are the ones who descend, who look, who ask the questions that the stone invites, not with sledgehammers, but with attention, with the willingness to sit in the dark and listen to what the earth has to say. And what does the earth say? Here in Cappadocia, in the carved chambers of Derinkuyu, it says, "We were here, we were afraid, and we were ingenious, and we were determined, and we survived. We built something extraordinary, not to be celebrated, but to be safe. We went underground, not because we gave up on the surface, but because we intended to return to it. We sealed the doors from the inside, not because we planned to stay forever, but because we needed to control when we came out. We maintained this city across generations, not out of habit, but out of love. Love for our children, and our faith, and our wine, and our ordinary lives. Love for the surface world that kept trying to destroy us, and that we kept returning to anyway. The rolling stone doors can be opened from the inside. They were always meant to be opened. The question was only ever when. Tonight, somewhere in Turkey, the ventilation shafts of Derinkuyu are drawing the same night air that moves across the plateau above, the same air that has moved across this crossroads of empires for millennia. The temperature in the deepest chambers is exactly what it always is, cool and still and perfectly preserved. The stone is patient in the way that only stone can be, holding its carved shapes against the slow erosion of time, remembering in its substance everything that human memory has forgotten. And somewhere in Greece, perhaps, a descendant of the Cappadocian communities that were forced from their homeland in 1923 is living an ordinary life, carrying in their blood the memory of people who went underground and came back up again and again across more than 2,000 years. The memory is there even if the story has been lost. The endurance is there even if the tunnels are far away. The thing that was preserved in the dark has found its way into the light, carried in the bodies of the people who descended and returned, who sealed the doors and opened them again, who waited in the stone and then walked back into the sun. The archive is always there, beneath the surface of what we think we know, beneath the official record and the celebrated monuments and the visible history. There is another archive carved into the darkness, sealed from the inside, waiting for the right question to open it. We have been asking that question tonight, and the stone, as always, has been answering. If you found yourself drawn into the depths of this story, if the patience of the stone and the endurance of the people who carved it stayed with you through the telling, then this is where you belong, in the dark hours. There are more files in the archive, more buried truths waiting to be read, more questions that the official record refuses to answer. Leave a comment and tell me what other hidden histories keep you awake at night, the ones that feel too strange or too large to fit into the story we are usually given. I want to know what the archive might have missed and what connections you see that I have not yet made. And if tonight's descent felt like the kind of thing that belongs in a quiet hour, consider returning to it when sleep next eludes you. The layers have a way of revealing themselves differently with each listen, or share it with someone who might need it. Someone else who finds the buried questions more comforting than the official answers. Every time a story like this passes between two people, it does what Derinkuyu itself did. It preserves something that deserves to be remembered, and it finds its way to whoever was always meant to hear it. The plateau of Cappadocia is quiet now. The fairy chimneys stand in the moonlight, their strange shapes casting shadows on the soft volcanic earth. Shapes that look in this light like figures standing still, like sentinels who have been watching the plateau since before any of the empires that crossed it existed. Below the surface, 18 stories down, the ventilation shafts breathe. The rolling stone doors rest in their carved tracks, capable of being opened, waiting for the inside to decide. The city remembers everything. It has been waiting a very long time to be remembered in return. Let the stones settle around you. Let the cool, still air of the deep chambers fill your breathing. Let the questions rest, unanswered, but not unanswerable, waiting in the dark, where questions are most comfortable. The archive does not close, it simply grows quiet. And in that quiet, perhaps, you can hear it. The faint sound of 20,000 people going about their lives in the dark, maintaining what matters, waiting for the moment to open the door and come back into the light. The sound of children learning the corridors by feel. The sound of lamps burning steadily in the still air. The sound of a congregation singing in a stone church 18 stories below the world. The sound of endurance, which is quieter than triumph, but more durable than either victory or defeat. They always came back into the light. So will you. The Romans built their own hidden world above ground, embedding inventions and systems into the architecture of empire that were quietly buried by the centuries that followed. That file is already in the archive. Roman inventions that were hidden from us is waiting for you, and what you find there about who controlled that knowledge and why it disappeared sits alongside everything Derinkuyu has just told you in a way that is difficult to ignore.